Just when you thought the tensions in the Middle East could not rise any further, and with hopes floated that President Trump's unorthodox diplomacy style may lead to de-escalatory agreements with Iran, Netanyahu launched his Operation Rising Lion. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and this is the CMEC podcast. On the evening of the 12th of June, Israel fired missiles into Iran, saying that it had intelligence that Iran was approaching the point of no return in developing a nuclear weapon. Over the last 7 days, Israel and Iran have traded missile attacks on an unprecedented scale, with civilian fatalities on both sides and Iran striking a hospital in Tel Aviv. We are delighted to be joined from Jerusalem by Tom Helm, the Jerusalem correspondent for the national newspaper. Tom, welcome.
Hello there.
Tom, can I take you back 1 week? It may feel like a long time ago, but can I take you back 7 days? What were you doing when Netanyahu launched the first strike?
Well, I was enjoying a holiday in France, much like many people, many journalists were at the time. There were not many indications that a war was on the horizon. There were a few events in the diplomatic calendar coming up that suggested that even though the diplomacy was tough, that there were still diplomatic talks happening to avoid such a conflict. So when the war broke out, we were all very surprised. I had to rush back, but in a sign of quite how dramatic the development was, Ben Gurion Airport, which is normally a sign of Israel's resilient, ultra-high security place and has basically remained running ceaselessly since the Gaza war. Well, it shut its airspace, and the national carrier El Al, which takes pride in flying even in times of war when all other airlines are cancelling, quickly whisked its aircraft to foreign airports for fear that they would be bombed if they were sitting on the tarmac in Ben Gurion. So I made the call to come back. I did it through flying from Marseille to Istanbul to Sharm el-Sheikh. I then took a taxi from the south of Sinai to the Taba border crossing, the Israel-Egypt border crossing that is basically the only one that's been operating as normal. The Jordanian crossings are still open, but with pretty random and unpredictable opening hours. And then I took the bus from Eilat in the very south of Israel to an empty and very quiet Jerusalem. I then very quickly got into the swing of reporting. The first excursion I did was to the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Bnei Brak near Tel Aviv, to the site of a special educational needs school that was struck by an Iranian missile. And we were there a day or so after, and residents were coming back to retrieve their belongings. But the scene was astonishing. It quickly woke me up to quite how massive this moment is, because I've seen many missile impacts throughout the course of reporting over the Gaza war. But this was just one Iranian missile that, rather than destroying a house, had basically destroyed an entire street.
So Israel, sadly, is no stranger to attack attempts, and the population live under that threat constantly. Did this feel very different?
Very different. What we're seeing now is that despite the sort of impressive interception rates of Israel's air defense, when a missile gets through, and they are getting through, even if it's just one, the damage caused and the casualties inflicted are unprecedented. We've seen a number of deaths. The official count is currently at 24. And the damage caused is astonishing. I was at a hospital in Beersheba yesterday, where only one strike had basically blown out all of the windows of this massive sprawling hospital complex.
Goodness, and I mean, we've been reading about the variations in whether tensions are escalating or de-escalating. We've been reading about diplomacy. But in a macro sense, on the ground, was there a feeling that tensions were building, or were people beginning to relax and feel that there may be a way to de-escalate the Iran tensions with a Trump presidency?
It appeared that the talks were running out of steam. I think it was nonetheless a surprise at how quickly they did. And the reports from the White House, from the American side, were still that President Trump was against Israel hitting Iran. So I'd say that it was a big surprise when it happened.
I'm Charlotte Leslie. You're listening to the CMEC podcast, and we're talking to Thomas Helm, the Jerusalem correspondent for the national newspaper from Jerusalem. Taking us back a few years, Tom, to the JCPOA, the so-called Iran nuclear deal, which was agreed in 2015. In 2018, under Trump's first presidency, the US left it, which really shattered its efficacy dramatically. Do you think that this could have been avoidable if the US had remained in the JCPOA and the JCPOA had continued?
It's an interesting question. My hunch is no, because Israel and indeed quite a few Arab states were very unhappy with the JCPOA. The idea of curtailing the nuclear program on its own was, if it had worked, obviously was a good thing. But I think what made people most unhappy was that the deal, they felt, basically left out the concerns of the neighboring Middle Eastern states. So, crucially, there were no real limits on Iran's sponsoring of proxies, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, whose names we now hear so often. And also, very importantly, Iran's ballistic missile program, which, although we don't hear as much about on the news, is probably as important a target for Israel in its current bombing campaign. And then I think it's also important to consider that what started this build up to the Iran-Israel fighting is October 7. And October 7 was a Hamas-led initiative. So I think that, an agreement like the JCPOA, while it might have been very good for global diplomacy and tensions, it said nothing about the lasting, enduring Palestinian issues on Israel's borders. And I don't think that, again, with no solution to that, the tinderbox that is the Israel-Palestine conflict wouldn't have erupted in this massive fashion, and therefore we probably would still be here.
You've just mentioned the proxies, Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis and Hamas. Moving on to where we are now, with Tehran in tatters increasingly, certainly targeted, what's going to happen with those proxy groups? Are you going to see sort of a rush of resources and relocation of Tehran's ability to those proxy groups? Or will those proxy groups' ability to function be shattered as the base is undermined?
Well, most of the proxies are already greatly diminished, and the ability of Iran to resupply them is greatly limited, obviously, by Iran being under so much pressure now. But I think in particular the toppling of Bashar al-Assad, Syria was a major transport route for Iranian weapons, and that route is now pretty much out of the question. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is greatly diminished. It has some capabilities. There are some reports it's rebuilding, but it's far from certain that they would get involved, whether Iran could compel them to get involved, and even if they did, whether they could do that much damage. Hamas is also considered greatly weakened. It's not defeated, and it does still send in the odd rocket, which is interesting given the war's been going on for so long. But again, greatly diminished and uncertain as to how much real pressure they could put on Israel. The Houthis are interesting. The Houthis have been belligerent throughout all of this. They are widely viewed as the Iranian proxy that is the least controllable by Iran. And they certainly could continue their disruptions in Israel, also against international shipping, although those attacks have slightly diminished recently because of a deal struck with President Trump. So the proxies are not out of the question. But again, this ring of fire that Iran for so long was relying on is not what it was. And that is yet another massive problem for Iran as it enters what could be a very, very open-ended long war.
So going back into Iran, the aim of this is to disarm Iran of its nuclear weapons capability. that is literally buried under mountains, as we understand it. What do you think the likelihood is of the US actually managing to achieve sort of an end to capability, any kind of nuclear weapon capability?
I think if they strike Fordo with the bunker busters that they possess that no one else does, there's a strong chance that the damage is massive. What is less certain is whether Iran will, number one, ever be able to make a nuclear program again. The chances are that it probably would be because it has this domestic know-how. And then after this possible American strike, whether the war can be tidily wrapped up, my hunch is very much that it will be a lot harder to do that.
There have been reports, and I don't know whether you have any sight on this at all. There have been reports of Chinese planes flying to Tehran and questions asked over China's involvement in this. Have you got any sight on what that might be and any thoughts on what China's stance is going to be on this? China obviously traditionally preferring a peaceful environment in which to operate rather than a disruptive one. Is that anything that you've heard anything on?
I think the overall theme when it comes to Iran's big power allies, Russia and China, is that they're not stepping up. And that is probably a motivating factor for President Trump to get involved. And I'm sure he will be happy to see that countries like China, North Korea, and Russia don't necessarily have the guts to step in and save Iran. So I don't know. I don't know about those specific reports, but I would just caution that while something like that might be happening, it really doesn't seem like Iran's powerful allies are willing to get involved to save it.
And I guess this poses real difficulties, both politically and very much in reality, for the surrounding Gulf states with contamination fears and where they sit on previously having helped Israel intercept Iranian missiles, how geopolitically they manage it, and how they might manage any literal fallout.
Very much so. And the Middle Eastern states have had an interesting relationship with Iran in the last few years. After attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure, there was a general feeling that these states couldn't rely on 100% guaranteed US military protection. So they entered into diplomatic talks with Iran, and relations seemed to be warming. But I think it's important to say that that was in a different age when Iran didn't feel quite as threatened. The situation is so bad for Iran now that it will, if it comes to the question of regime survivability, Iran is likely to pull out all the stops. And one of the big ways in which they could do that is regional destabilization. So that means attacks against US bases and assets in the region, but it could also mean attacks against non-US energy infrastructure in the region, urban areas. And this really is a worst case scenario, but it is a very dramatic one. And the longer this war goes on, the more desperate the picture seems for the Iranians, the more likely such a scenario could unravel.
There's been quite a lot of talk of Netanyahu's aim being to topple the regime, with the idea that they are not a popular regime and many Iranians want them out. How likely do you think that is? Is it even possible? Or will Iranians, regardless of their views of the regime, consolidate under the attack from another country?
I think this is a fascinating question. And I lived in Iran for a bit, so I have some sort of on the ground read on the situation. I think that it's clear that the Iranian regime is hated, if not despised, by much, if not most, of the population there. And I think this is a sense that a lot of Israelis will tell you. They say, you know, these strikes on top of getting rid of the nuclear threat will also pave the way for Iranian freedom. But my hunch, having lived there, is that Iran is a peculiar mix of anti-government, but very, very patriotic, traumatized from previous wars like the Iran-Iraq War, in which the overall sense was that the world was with Saddam Hussein and against them. This is including Western powers and Israel. And they have a many thousand-year history of invasions and resilience and resistance. This is the Iranian view of things. So I don't think that it's a bomb launched at Iran could ever really be a symbol for Iranians of liberation. Instead, it taps into this millennia-old paranoia and sense of vulnerability. So the effect might well be rallying around the flag, if not necessarily the regime. I think there's other sides to it. Obviously, the regime has lost a lot of its legitimacy for not being able to provide Iranians with a decent economic life. Much more severely than that, obviously, all the massive political persecutions that have been going on there for so long. So the regime has probably taken a massive hit in its legitimacy. It's already dwindling legitimacy. But I wouldn't be surprised if the main sort of object of anger is still the aggressors in the eyes of the Iranians, which are the Israelis and perhaps soon to be the US.
I'm Charlotte Leslie. You're listening to the CMEC podcast, and we're talking to Tom Helm, the Jerusalem correspondent for the national newspaper from Jerusalem. Things weren't going so well for Netanyahu domestically, politically, prior to this. The hostages hadn't been returned. We saw protests. Has this aggression saved Netanyahu's political skin domestically?
I think it certainly secured it in the short term, the short to medium term. Netanyahu still faces political issues that, for me, appear insurmountable. But it is very interesting to see how quickly these issues that were tearing apart Israeli society before this have just been swept to the wayside. Obviously, people here still care massively about the hostages, but I've just anecdotally picked on so much less talk about them. Netanyahu was facing a sort of internal coalition crisis before this about the drafting of ultra-Orthodox soldiers. That was actually solved a few days before. Let's not say solved, but delayed. He came to an agreement within his coalition. But the Israelis do rally around the flag, and this is a very popular war. Israelis, I'd say the strong majority of Israelis do recognize Iran as an existential threat, the nuclear program, but they also say that it was the top of the command chain of the October 7 attacks. So I think as long as the war is popular, Netanyahu will be popular. Maybe popular is the wrong word, but people will stick by him. Whenever this ends, it will be a different question, I think. But who knows what Netanyahu will be able to pull out of the hat that time round. It's become a cliche to say that he's the ultimate political survivor, but it really does. I mean, this whole episode just reinforces again that he is this unbelievable staying power.
With, I suppose, a very unorthodox president, the other side of the pond in Trump, neither of whom, follow the rule book. They tend to take big risks, which adds to the unpredictability. Is that right?
Yes, definitely. And it's worth noting that when Trump left office after the first administration, him and Netanyahu had a massive falling out. He was welcomed with open arms by Israelis during the second administration. And there is, for example, a US ambassador here, Mike Huckabee, who is, you couldn't ask me to design a more pro-Israel American official. But it does, there were moments in the second administration where it seemed like the two were falling out again. I think this latest development is a sign that the relationship is in step.
And you mentioned fascinatingly that talk of the hostages, which has really very understandably dominated protests and concerns, is now being superseded by the Iran-Israel conflict. While all eyes are on Iran, what else is going on in Gaza and the West Bank?
Well, in Gaza, the killing continues. The military operations continue. The real scandal of aid distribution, if you can call it that, continues. GHF, the US-backed aid distribution mechanism that the Israelis have endorsed, continues to see massive killings at its sites, stampedes, Israeli military shootings. So the picture hasn't really changed there. If anything, it's got worse because global attention does matter, and global attention is massively diverted at the moment. In the West Bank, it's all but shut down. The Israeli military have kept open some roads that Israelis use, But the internal roads linking Palestinian areas are all but shut off. Now, this was happening a lot before the war, but now, I mean, it's totally halted. And new gates along these routes are being installed as well. I'd also add that places like Jerusalem, it's worth thinking about. I live in the Old City, and the Old City is closed. The holy sites are closed. I mean, I think there's a small number of Jewish worshippers going to the Western Wall. And I might have seen some Muslims walking into Al-Aqsa today, but it would have been a very small number and mostly elderly people. And it's terrible for the economy here because I wouldn't say tourism was coming back to normal, but there were more visitors. And the economy in the West Bank is also a complete disaster. There's been fears about the PA collapsing for so long. But just if the small chances I've had to speak to Palestinian officials and diplomats that work on the West Bank say that, this war has really sped up those problems, the issue of public finances, the stability of the banking sector, and therefore we are perhaps the closest we've ever been to a collapse in the PA, which would have dramatic effects for the Holy Land.
Talk us through just briefly what might happen if we see a collapse of the PA.
If we see a collapse of the PA, we basically see the most profound shift in the sort of security arrangement in the West Bank in years. The PA has an important role in terms of civilian affairs, but also paying salaries and maintaining services in Area A, which basically is most of the urban Palestinian areas in the West Bank, but it also plays a very important security role with close coordination with Israeli security forces. The PA, because it's so unpopular, has lost control of areas like Jenin, Tulkarm, etc., which has basically caused the Israelis to swoop in and destroy these refugee camps and basically exert full military control, almost in a sort of Gaza fashion. But a full collapse of the PA security apparatus, bringing with it sort of security vacuums in major cities like Nablus and Ramallah, would probably see Israel step in, and therefore massive, an even more intense occupation than what we see right now. And it's worth noting that the collapse of the PA is a real priority of some extremists, some of the most extreme figures in Netanyahu's coalition. Probably not Netanyahu himself necessarily, because I think there's still an understanding among most security circles that the security role and the coordination it has with Israel is on balance a good thing for Israel. But for the extremists like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, total security collapse is a great cover in which to swarm the West Bank with Israeli military and effectively annex the territory.
To finish, I'm going to ask you something very unfair because obviously none of us know what's going to happen. But if you had to say, what would be your predicted trajectory for Gaza and the West Bank and for the Israel-Iran conflict?
It's very easy to start wars, far harder to end them. The big dynamic for Iran-Israel is actually the US at the moment. If the US gets involved, the Israelis are basically trying to pitch an option to Trump, which is you come in, you do this one very specific job with the bunker busting bombs and Fordow, and then you leave. And we have paved the way for you to get there with minimal risks to your aircraft. We've knocked out the air defenses. We have control of the skies. We just need you to do this one thing, and then you're out. Now, that's a very clean proposition that, if any, of the previous sort of conflicts in the Middle East over recent years have taught us, is quite hard to imagine really happening. So I think it's getting more and more likely that Donald Trump does do this strike. Therefore, more and more likely that the US gets brought into a longer war. If it doesn't stay the full course, then Israel will be in a long war, and that will be really damaging for Israel and obviously Iran. Iran is at the moment suffering in concrete terms far more than Israel is. But the toll on Israel is still massive, as we've seen. These huge strikes causing massive damage, huge disruption to civilian life in Israel. Schools, workplaces are not back to normal anywhere close. And there have also been reports that Israel's running low on interceptor missiles. And I wouldn't want to speculate, but anecdotally, it does seem that more missiles have been getting through in recent days. Now, in terms of Gaza and the West Bank, well, again, massive conflict in the region diverts attention, and therefore it gives Israel the grounds to carry on massive military control in the West Bank and these very bloody operations in Gaza. So I think we will see more of the same in Gaza if the war carries on, a massive deterioration in the situation in the West Bank as well.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I've been speaking to Thomas Helm of the national newspaper from Jerusalem. Tom, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Charlotte.